And then from colonization came the placement of Indigenous children in residential schools. And we saw over 150,000 Indigenous youth forcibly removed from their homes, the creation of 130 residential schools that were of extremely poor quality in terms of like just being safe for surviving the winters, but also the abuse that would occur in those facilities, the malnourishment that would occur in those facilities. And this isn't something that has been, absent in our lifetime. The last residential school did not close until 1996. And again, the goals of the residential schools were effectively cultural genocide, where Indigenous persons were forced to adopt Christian values and would be punished for speaking their own language. And that would involve like very serious physical punishment. And that created kind of a disconnect when they were going back home to their families for holidays, for example, because they would recall the trauma of being brutally beaten for speaking their own language, and their parents might not speak English. So they didn't want to speak their First Nations language because of the trauma that they had experienced, but then it makes it difficult for them to communicate with their parents who are unable to speak English. One of the consequences I don't think is talked about as much is the culture of unlearning of parenting skills due to basically the parents having their children ripped from them, and then they don't get that opportunity of practicing parenting skills. Moreover, these children who are sent away to residential schools don't get the opportunity to see positive parenting practices at work. So for you sitting at home or wherever you might be, if you have children or if you ever have children, the way that you parent might involve thinking back to how your parents responded to you when you did something well or when you did something wrong. For certain persons, and it's not just Indigenous persons, but we could see obviously especially because of residential schools, these children have had that ability to recall how their parents responded to them in positive ways or negative ways, but the learning of positive parenting practices in order to help perpetuate those positive parenting practices in the future. So if you want to kind of get a sense of the scope of residential schools and how many children were forcibly removed, the Coquitlam population is about 150,000 people. So imagine just like you're driving home from work and you're going through Coquitlam and every single person in that city is completely gone. So imagine how uncomfortable it would feel if you were a person living in that community and all of these children have just been forcibly removed from that community. How difficult and odd it would feel. Within BC, there are about 180,000 children between the ages of 1 and 4. So another way of thinking about it is just imagining basically every single child between ages 1 and 4 being removed from the province of British Columbia. And to put some of these residential school experiences into context, when we look at the odds that a child would have died while being placed in a residential school, it was actually higher than the odds of a service member dying while serving for Canada during World War II. When people think about residential schools, they might be more thinking about what was happening during the early 1900s. But this practice of cultural genocide really did continue throughout Canada for quite a long period of time. Some might even argue that it continues to occur. And one of the really big events where we witnessed this cultural genocide was the 1960s, which was what was referred to as the 60s scoop, where about 20,000 Indigenous youth were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to live in different foster care facilities, some within Canada, but some all the way down in the United States, and some even in Western Europe. So kids who were raised in Canada could be sent all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. The parents would have no idea where they actually were, whether they would actually get to see those children again. When I talked about the intergenerational transmission of different events, this is sort of how that transmission gets perpetuated. So we can see, for example, whether it's residential schools, the 60 scoop, the removal of children from their family, from their culture, and their support systems. And this can kind of disrupt cultural, spiritual coping and healing practices, especially when the children are being shamed and punished for trying to practice those cultural or spiritual traditions. And then these children get sent home to parents who are taught sort of the same unhealthy behaviors or taught to experience the same level of shame. And there's that disconnect between children and parents. And then when those children have their own children, we can see this cycle continue. And when we look at how this cycle has perpetuated inequity, we can see it in a lot of these social outcomes amongst Indigenous persons in Canada, where only about 2/3 of Indigenous persons have completed high school compared to about 87% of non-Indigenous persons. We see an overrepresentation of Indigenous persons in foster care, a lower median income, and increased likelihood of experiencing early mortality due to substance use, and a youth suicide rate that's about 6 times the national average and much, much higher, especially when we look at some of the northern territories, and none of it